Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on such a beautiful day and agreeing to sit inside. I'm Lindsay, I'm chair of the Center for Latino Policy Research, and we are very privileged to have Lindsay Perez here as our speaker today. Before I introduce Lindsay, I just want to direct your attention to our final talk, which is next Thursday. So it's been a very busy April. Patricia is going to be here to talk about English language learning post-Arizona. And so that promises to be a very interesting topic as well. So today's speaker, like I said, is Lindsay Perez. I've had the privilege of knowing Lindsay since she was an itty-bitty baby undergraduate at UC Irvine. She was in a senior capstone course that I taught, and she blew me away with the quality of the final paper that she managed to produce in 10 weeks, which was better than most of my grad students produced in a semester. And she went on to UCLA to get her PhD in education, which she just finished in December 2009, and has continued to blow people away by writing a ridiculous number of peer-reviewed articles, 12, which is what most people need, more than you need to get tenure. She's done before she's even become a faculty person. She's currently a research associate for UC Accord, where she's working on the Gates Foundation project called Pathways to Post-Secondary Success, Maximizing Opportunities for Youth in Poverty. People might remember that that's what Danny Solorzano and Amanda Datnow, who were here in January, they were presenting on that project. So Lindsay's one of that wonderful team of people who have been working on and doing this great work. Today she's going to be talking about work relevant to her dissertation, which was looking at undocumented and documented Chicana students in higher education and what are the factors that explain their resilience. So I'm so happy that she can be here with us, and I'm very much looking forward to her talk. So, Lindsay.
That was an amazing introduction. I hope I don't disappoint you. So I did my undergraduate work as a clinician at UC Irvine. I'm from the South Bay. I'm from California and I'm from Los Angeles, but a little bit more south of LA in the South Bay area. Carson, Torrance area, if you guys are familiar, anyone who's from the LA area knows that area. That's where I was from, and it's really interesting. I had one experience living in kind of an urban, LA County community, and then my parents moved us to this place called the Inland Empire in California, which is a very different space. And so I went to my last years of middle school and high school there. And after I graduated high school, it was an interesting trajectory. And I just tell people about, I think, my story of coming to higher education because I think it's important for us to tell our stories of how we arrived here. I was told by my high school counselor that I should, when I told him we had a mandatory meeting we had to have with our counselors of what our plans were after we graduated high school. And he knew that my mom was a hairdresser because we lived in kind of a small rural town, and everyone, if you needed beauty products or your haircut, my mom did it. So I told him that I wanted to go to college, and he told me that that was great, but maybe I should enroll in ROP and become a cosmetologist like my mom. And so I think that that experience kind of added to my motivation and what gets us through the educational pipeline, what gets Latino students to higher education and takes us through to getting that not only college degree but into graduate school. And as I moved into my undergraduate institution, I learned about this place called grad school, and I learned about this thing called a PhD and how it's for us as students of color to be in those spaces. And so at UC Irvine, I started getting involved in undergraduate research, and I've always done work around the Latino educational pipeline. And so my work has progressed over the years, and what I'm presenting today is my dissertation work and where I'm moving forward in that work. As Lisa mentioned, I did finish about 1.5 years ago. And so I'll share kind of the beginning part will be on my dissertation, and then the work that has kind of progressed from the dissertation and where I'm at now. And so the presentation is called Discourses of Racist Nativism in California Public Education. English Dominance is Racist Nativist Microaggressions, and my advisor tells me I love long titles, and I do, because I can't, it's so hard to capture your work in just a couple of words, and so I know it's a long title, but I think that this work is important to look at how our positionalities as students and these various worlds and roles that mediate our trajectories, how those emerge in everyday practices and education systems. And so I'll talk about that today. And so overview of the presentation is I'll tell you about the story. I just told you a story of my trajectory, but a story of how I came to this work, how I arrived to this work. I'll talk about my research questions that guide the study, the summary of my literature review, very brief in the area of the bodies of literature that I'm borrowing from. I'm a visual person, so I have a visual model of my theoretical framework. The methodological approach that I took to conduct this study. My findings on English dominance. How I'm looking at English dominance now as racist Nativist microaggressions in K-12 education. The responses that the women, and I'll talk about the women in a moment, had to racist Nativist microaggressions. And I'll talk about where I see my future research going and future research in this field and on microaggressions in particular. So my work started from really when I went to grad school, my advisor showed me this data, and this is data from US Census, and it's essentially the educational pipelines. And it shows us that for every, my pointer's not working, for every 100 students that enter an elementary school in the state of California, 95 of those white students will graduate from high school. Out of those 95 students, about half of them will continue on to higher education, four-year university to attain a bachelor's degree. 15 of those students will get some form of graduate degree, either a professional degree or a master's degree. And out of every 15 of those students, 2 will continue on to get a PhD. Now, if you look for Asian students, the attainment data is very similar. And if you look at African American students, it's similar until about high school. And they have this really interesting drop from high school to those who move on to college and get a four-year degree. But for Latino students, and this is what was really powerful for me, is that of every 100 students, almost half are lost after high school. Half don't make it even to graduate from high school. 12 of those students continue on to a four-year university. Only 3 will graduate with some type of graduate degree, whether in a professional program or in a master's program. And less than one person, less than a half of a person, will continue on to get a PhD. And so I think that speaks to a lot of the work that the center does in terms of the training that students are getting here. When we see numbers like this number spoke to me when I saw this. And so this was also not just a motivation for me to continue on in the pipeline, but to figure out how do we get more students through this pipeline onto PhD education. And so here I'm going to show you a clip, and this is a clip of Daisy from the documentary some of you may have seen, Waiting for Superman. And it talks about this little 9-year-old Daisy and her, I think it's a humanizing look at some of this data and how students move through the educational pipeline. She lives in East Los Angeles, which is, I'm sure you guys have know about some of the demographics. Historically, Latino community, immigrant community, very infamous for the low educational opportunity for students living in that area and making it through the educational pipeline. So I'll show you this clip of Daisy as a glimpse at Latino public education in California.
I want to be a nurse, I want to be a doctor, and I want to be a veterinarian.
She chose her college and she wrote a letter to the admissions and asking them to allow her to attend their college.
I want to go to a medical college or a veterinarian college because I really want to become a surgeon.
Yeah.
Daisy's path to medical school begins with 8th grade algebra, which she'll need to take when she moves up to Stevenson Middle School. By the time she leaves Stevenson, only 13% of her classmates will be proficient in math. Stevenson feeds into Roosevelt, one of the worst performing high schools in Los Angeles. Only 3 out of 100 students at Roosevelt will graduate with the classes necessary for admission to a four-year university. And 57% of Daisy's classmates won't graduate.
So I show this clip in the presentations that I do, and kind of after I show that data, because this really shows the face of the students that are in this data, that are in these statistics, and the everyday lives of students. The issues of, we can have tremendous aspirations coming into educational institutions, which is also counter to the dominant discourse around Latino families and parents who don't think that education and schooling is important. But how there's a structure and there's an educational system that is created and is perpetuated so students cannot attain those aspirations. And so part of my work has been how do we understand those aspirations, and how do we support students so that they can get through that pipeline to reach those very early dreams that they have. And so I started working when I came to UCLA. As Lisa mentioned, I did my graduate training there, and I actually showed up to the Chicano Studies Research Center because I needed a job. And I said, I have these, here's my resume, here's what I've done in the past. Do you have anything I could do here? Because I really need a job. And so I was working with Carlos Haro at the time, who was the assistant director. He's now retired. But he said, we've been for the past couple of years, we've been thinking that we want to do a conference that focuses on transitions in Latino educational pipeline that will move more students through. And I said, okay, that's my work. So they hired me to work on this conference that would focus on what are those critical transitions in the Latino educational pipeline that will help more students move through not just four-year universities, but into graduate education to get a PhD. And so I worked on this project about a year and a half, and in 2006, it was March 2006, we had the conference. And we had community members, we had students, we had researchers, we had educators come together in this space to talk about how we improve the pipeline for Latino students. And we focused on Los Angeles because of really the crisis of public education in Los Angeles and the communities that we serve. And so it was interesting because there was a presentation being done by the superintendent of Montebello School District, which in Los Angeles is another urban major city in a district within a district. And he said he had to leave, he had to excuse himself during the presentation because he said there was some urgent issues that he needed to go to in his district. There was something going on. So throughout the day, we found out that there was a massive protest happening, and that was initiated. It happened March 25th, 2006. There was a mass demonstration happening in downtown Los Angeles, but really throughout the nation, against HR 4437, which was a bill introduced by a very racist senator in New York who wanted to further criminalize immigrants and further criminalize undocumented immigrants and anyone associated, anyone who knew that there was someone with an undocumented status, and would criminalize them as well. So we're talking about schools, we're talking about church organizations, we're talking about community organizations. A very disturbing bill. And so it was actually at that conference, and that superintendent left because students initiated that movement. They walked out of their high schools. Middle school students were walking out. Elementary school students were walking out, protesting this legislation. And so the following day, this was when we heard about this demonstration that was happening. I remember I went with a colleague of mine, Maria, to this protest, and I brought my daughter, and she brought her sister, and we had a group of us that went. And arriving at this demonstration and seeing the nearly 1 million people in the white shirts and walking in those streets that day was just, I think, a critical transition in my journey to this work. And so it was at this protest that we saw this little girl, and this little girl was about 9 years old at the time, no, maybe about 8. And she had this sign that said, "Racism must die for humanity to live." And so we asked her, can we take a picture? And her mom's like, no, not me, her. So she was in the background. But I think it really spoke to this 9-year-old little girl was aware. She was very aware that this legislation, that this movement was about racism, right? It was an anti-immigrant bill, but it was an anti-immigrant bill specifically targeting a group of people. And that was immigrants of color, and specifically Latinos in this bill, HR 4437. And so that's what kind of pushed me to this work is how does immigration status and race come to an intersection, and how does that intersection mediate educational trajectories of students who are obviously, like this little girl, very aware that it's happening to them. And so the research questions that guided this study is how do discourses of racist nativism, and I'll talk about that in a moment, emerge in the educational trajectories of undocumented U.S.-born Chicana college students attending a public four-year research university. And I wanted to look at what are the consequences of these discourses in their educational trajectories. But I knew that these women also have very powerful responses, that they aren't passive in this process either. And so I wanted to look at the ways that they're responding to this. And so the second question was, what are the similarities and differences in the educational experiences of undocumented U.S.-born Chicana college students? Because I knew that even though with my work with the students at this UC institution, there was a very strong, active group of undocumented AB 540 student organization there on campus. And I knew that although we're racialized in some of the same ways, that we don't necessarily have to be an immigrant to be racialized as an immigrant, there are clear barriers and there are clear circumstances that undocumented students have to deal with in their day-to-day lives that US-born students have. We have the privilege that we don't necessarily have to. And so I also looked at how do women in this study navigate higher education despite all of these obstacles that they face, so that other students can learn from these strategies as we go through the pipeline. And so very briefly, I'll talk about the bodies of work that I borrowed from. So I looked at the historical racialization of Mexican immigrants and how immigration laws and policies are used as tools in this process of racialization and exclusion, and how that's done historically to various groups of immigrants, not just Mexicanos and not just Latinos, but in this contemporary moment of anti-immigrant sentiment, it does target Latinos, and that has been the consistency across time. And I also look at undocumented students' access to education. So there's a historical context of AB 540 and undocumented students' access to education, so I looked at some of that work. And then I look at the time, and when I first came to this project, it was about 6 years ago, so there was a small body of work on undocumented Latino college students in particular. And now it's grown, and I think that there is a lot more work, and so that's amazing that it's a growing body of work. At the time I was looking at obstacles and navigational strategies of those students. And so my theoretical framework is, I'm gonna walk over here. I'm a critical race theorist in education. And as a critical race theorist, we use theory to bring in the experiences of students into our work. And so critical race theory has 5 kind of central tenets of what it helps us do in the research process. And so the first is that it's an interdisciplinary perspective. We're able to borrow from political science, we're able to borrow from sociology, we're able to borrow from ethnic studies, from Chicana Chicano studies, from African American studies, and bring what is useful to us into our work to create frames and to create methodological processes and to create theory that is useful for the type of work that we're doing. It's got a challenge, there's a challenge to dominant ideologies. We're trying to counter the majoritarian narrative, what we call it, or the dominant discourses about students of color. The centrality of experiential knowledge, so bringing the lived experiences of students and students of color into the research process is another central tenet of critical race theory. The intercentricity of race and racism, intercentricity, I go back and forth with this word because it's kind of funny, but we're really talking about the intersectionality of various forms of oppression, of race and racism, but also knowing that class has something to do with it, that gender has something to do with it, that immigration status has something to do with the way students' lives are mediated in their educational pipelines. And Latino critical theory is a branch of CRT, and it essentially encompasses those 5 tenets, but it also looks at the specific issues significant to the Latino community and how Latinos navigate the educational pipeline. And so we're interested in issues like immigration status, language, ethnicity, culture, phenotype, and surname. And so what LatCrit allows us to do is to look at this intersection of how race and immigration status intersects in the daily lives of students of color and Latino students in particular. But we also know that class and we also know that gender plays a role in this. And so this is where, this is the intersection that I'm looking at, essentially. And so this is where the work on racist nativism has developed, and this comes from some work that my colleagues and I have done in the Department of Education. And so racist nativism, that was a piece I think some of you have read. But what we've done is, there's a long kind of trajectory of how we've developed racist nativism, but we decided we need to put it into kind of some 3 central tenets of what is racist nativism and how do we explain it in the way that's easier to understand. And so here I tried to do that. And so racist nativism occurs within a historical and contemporary context. And this is when I'm talking about the historical racialization of Latino immigrants and US-born immigrants, US-born Latinos. It intersects with other forms of oppression, and it's also based on real and perceived immigration status. And so here, again, is where we borrow from other fields, particularly MEMI, on the significance of perceptions, that you don't necessarily have to be a Latino immigrant to be racialized as immigrant, and what that racialization process and what those perceptions mean. And so here is where discourses of racist nativism are conceptualized. And so what do discourses of racist nativism look like? Well, they assign a subordinate status to Latino immigrants. They shape perceptions of contemporary U.S. immigration and immigration policies, and they become institutionalized through social policy. And so we're talking about educational policy, healthcare policy, a range of policies that guide our institutions, right, in U.S. society. And so what does racist nativism or discourses of racist nativism look like in the everyday life? And so I think that, let's walk over here. This is an image, and actually an image that I got from Google when I searched immigrant. Is you can get images like this that represent what the meaning of the word immigrant is, right? Stop the invasion, that there's a perceived threat of the immigrant coming into the U.S. and taking over, our spaces, taking over our institutions. There's also this notion of criminality that's attached to that. That's also very gendered, right? That's also very masculinized. And we can see some of this playing out just last April, right, a year ago from today, with SB 1070 in Arizona and that legislation that passed in the state that further criminalized undocumented immigrants and brought local enforcement agencies into the process of deporting and the process of exposing undocumented immigrants in that state. And so the data that I'm using for this work is I use a network sampling method, and so I had contacted key people who worked with students in the institution to refer me to students who might be interested in participating in the study. There were 10 undocumented students and 10 US-born students, so it was a total of 20 women that I talked to. I had a total of 40 testimonial interviews, which I'll discuss in a moment. There was 2 with each participant. I also conducted 2 focus groups, and I'll talk about that also in the methodological approach, because these weren't traditional focus groups where I asked a group a question. I had a series of questions. The focus groups were actually sites of collaborative data analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the methodological approach. So the requirements of the participants that they were all Mexicana, right? They were all women from low-income families, and at the time of the interview, they were either undocumented or U.S.-born. So the methodological approach that I use in this study, I draw a lot from the work of Dolores Delgado Bernal, who is a professor at the University of Utah. And she says, in her words, the relationship between methodology and a researcher's theoretical and epistemological orientation is not always explicit, but it is inevitably closely connected. And for me, this quote really guides my methodological approach, that the epistemological stance that I take, the theories that I use, and the methodological approaches that I take are very much interconnected in this work. And so I'm going to show you another visual of my methodological approach. And I'd be happy to talk about this more in depth. I'm going to go through this to try to get to my findings so we can have enough time to do that. But LatCrit and racist nativism are the frames that really frame the work that I'm doing. And I use Chicana feminist epistemology in education, in particular cultural intuition. And what Chicana feminist epistemology in education allows us to do is it allows us to counter the traditional researcher-subject relationships. It allows us to deconstruct that power dynamic between the researcher as the superior, the person who should know, the person who's going to analyze and tell these people what their experience is like and the reasons that they're experiencing what they are in education, and to bring the women themselves into the research process to co-theorize and to build theory from their lived experiences. So I use testimonio as a critical race methodology. And what testimonio allows us to do is I use it as an interviewing strategy. And testimonio consciously works towards dismantling this power dynamic between the researcher-subject relationship and also incorporating the women into the research process itself to co-theorize about their experiences. And I use a critical race grounded theory. And so for those of you, I'm obviously a qualitative researcher, and for those of you that are familiar with qualitative research and grounded theory, what my colleagues and I have done in kind of constructing a critical race grounded theory is taking what's useful to us from traditional grounded theory methods, right? And so building experiences, looking for emerging themes from the data, right? Letting the data speak to you is one thing that was very useful to us. But we know that the research process is part of a colonial project and is constructed in a particular way. And so we argue that critical frames in that process are necessary, whereas Glaser and Strauss, when they were conceptualizing grounded theory, a priori theory in the literature review shouldn't happen until you've already looked at the data. Well, we argue that in order to uncover and unveil those institutional systems of power that mediate students' experiences, we need those critical frames in the research process. And so that's the analytical strategy that we used in this work. And so my first area of findings, I have several area of findings in my much bigger dissertation project, but I'm going to talk about one area of findings today. And so through this data analysis process, there were specific discursive practices of difference that emerged in their educational trajectories and the women's trajectories. And so I used kind of this typology to describe the practice, to describe the assigned value that that student experienced according to that practice, and the discourse of racist nativism, the message that was being told in that experience and that assigned value through that practice. And so I look at English dominance, and English dominance was one of the predominant themes that came up from these women's experiences, is how they came in as Spanish dominant students into an English-only, English-dominant environment, and how that impacted them as students. And so I look at the practice of English dominance. And the assigned value that this practice assigns, right, these students, is that the Spanish language is inferior. And the discourse of racist nativism that reinforces that assigned value is that the English language is superior and that the native speaks English. That the normalized language, that in order to be a successful student, you have to learn the language, the dominant language, right? And so these are the practices that happen to the women very early on in their trajectories, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so what did English dominance as discursive practice look like? And so the first story, the first testimonial that I'll share with you is from Alicia. And so what I did with the women in our series of interviews is I asked them to tell me to begin with their first memory of being in school, their first educational memory. And for many of the women, it was very early on in preschool and in kindergarten. That experience of coming as a Spanish dominant student into an English-only environment or an English-dominant environment. And so Alicia describes a preschool experience, her first day of preschool, that she still remembers and is very powerful as a 22-year-old sophomore in college. And she said, so I got into preschool and I didn't know English at all. My mom says that the teachers thought I was really shy and I didn't want to participate. So they called in my mom and they said, let's have a conference because something's going on with this girl. So my mom was in there and they tell her, you know, your daughter's not paying attention, she doesn't do any of the stuff we tell her, she doesn't talk. You should go have her ears checked. Maybe she's deaf or maybe there's something else not functioning in her ears. And my mom was like, oh my God, maybe she can't hear. She laughs. So my mom took me to the doctor and everything was fine. So my mom took me back and said, look, you know, my daughter's fine. And they came to the conclusion that it wasn't because I was deaf, it was because they didn't understand anything they were telling me. And so I think in this experience with Alicia, it's really powerful that the teacher, and she went to preschool in a predominantly Latino immigrant community in downtown Los Angeles. And that the teacher who is in this community and is teaching these students doesn't acknowledge the fact that maybe there's someone in this classroom who doesn't understand the language of the classroom, who doesn't understand English. And that instead of going from, you know, maybe we should try talking to this girl in Spanish, the language of the community, maybe there's something wrong with her. Maybe there must be some deficiency for this student, that she's not engaging in the class in the ways that she's supposed to, that she's not interacting with other people in the class in the ways that she's supposed to. So I think this is a really powerful example of English dominance in the classroom and how, you know, a good teacher does identify potential barriers in student learning. But the fact that this teacher jumped to the conclusion that, you know, maybe there's something physically wrong with her was really problematic. And so again, this is a discursive practice of English dominance. She was learning that the Spanish language is inferior, and through that message, she's learning that the English language is superior, that the English language is a normalized language, the language that she should know. And so this is where my work has moved now on English dominance. So I wanted to look at this concept of English dominance and how English dominance happens in K-12 classrooms, because for all of the women, they describe very early experiences. And so looking at those very early experiences, I think, is important. And so Bell Hooks has this really powerful quote, and it says, "It is not the English language that hurt me, but what the oppressors do with it. How they shape it to become a territory that limits and defines. How they make it a weapon that can shame, humiliate, and colonize." And so Bell Hooks here is talking about how the English language is used not only to subordinate students, but is used strategically as a project of colonization, as a project of subordination that keeps students in their place, that keeps the reproduction of the educational system moving, right? And I think that is very powerful to look at English dominance in that way. And so I'm looking at English dominance through the lens of racial microaggressions. And I'll talk about racial microaggressions. And so this work really started with African-American psychiatrist who's now at Harvard. He's a Harvard professor in the late 1960s. And so this work happened very early on. And he was looking at experiences of racial, what he called offensive actions and offensive mechanisms in African-American communities. And he said most offensive actions are not gross and crippling. They are subtle and stunning. The enormity of the complications can be appreciated only when one considers that these subtle blows are delivered incessantly. And so he's talking about a daily experience with these very covert, no longer are overt forms of racism, but covert experiences with racism in everyday life. And so later in his work, he uses the term racial microaggressions to describe these acts. And he says racial microaggressions are the subtle, stunning, often automatic, verbal and nonverbal exchanges, which are put-downs of blacks by offenders. And so what do racial microaggressions look like? And so this is a really funny clip from Queen Latifah in Saturday Night Live, it's a commercial called Excedrin for racial tension headaches. And so I'm going to start that, keeping in mind what this clip is saying about microaggressions and the everyday experiences of African American women.
Do I get stress headaches at work? Yes, definitely. From the moment I get it, it's, Denise, we need this. Denise, we need that. Which is stressful, because my name is Linda. Denise is the other black woman that works here. By 10 a.m., someone in the copy room makes a joke about Kobe Bryant, and everyone looks at me to make sure it's okay. And I smile like it's okay. But really, my head next to questions like, yes, black people use shampoo, and no, I don't know any good reggae clubs around here. And yes, Condoleezza Rice is very articulate. Why do you sound so surprised? And no, I can't tell you where to buy weed. And that's when I reach for Excedrin. New Excedrin for racial tension headaches. Excedrin RT works fast, taking me from oh no you didn't to I wish your mother would.
Excedrin for racial tension headaches. Fast relief in hundreds of years of data.
So this, other than being very hilarious, this clip is really good because it shows how racial microaggressions, these very covert racial slights, as Chester Pierce calls them, emerge in everyday life and how they impact in this clip African American women, but how people of color are affected by them, how people of color experience them, what they sound like, what they look like in everyday life. And so some other examples of racial microaggressions is you're not like the rest of them, you're different. If only there were more of them like you. I don't think of you as Mexican. You speak such good English, but you speak without an accent. And so these are some of the ways that racial microaggressions occur in everyday life, right? They're no longer these overt kind of racial, in the ways that we understand racism historically. You know, this isn't people in white gowns and this isn't racial epithets, right? This is people making racial slights at you, but in a very different way, in a very covert way. And why it's so tricky to uncover and why it's so tricky to name. And racial microaggressions allows us to name these experiences. And so bringing racial microaggressions into education, Amanda Lewis does some work on, it's called Race in the Schoolyard, Negotiating the Color Line in the Classroom and Communities. And so she's interviewing very young African American students. This is 9-year-old London, and she's interviewing London about her experiences with race and racism. And so Amanda Lewis says, has anybody ever been mean to you or treated you differently because of your color? And London says, yeah. How so? People in the store. What happened? A month ago, he accused me because he just started yelling, but I don't know why though. Do you think he was yelling at you because you were black? Yes. How do you know? I don't know, it just sounded like it. And so when we think about how racial microaggressions emerge, we can see how students at a very young age, students of color at a very young age, can begin to understand the ways that they're subordinated, can begin to understand the ways that they're racialized, and a process of very covert actions, daily interactions with people. Those are the citations. And so what do racial microaggressions look like in education? And so this is the work of Dr. Daniel Solórzano, Miguel Ceja, and Tarayoso, who have brought racial microaggressions as a lens into the field of education. And they say that racial microaggressions are one form of a systemic, everyday racism that are subtle, layered, and cumulative, verbal and nonverbal assaults directed towards people of color that are committed automatically and unconsciously. And so I think it's really powerful that these experiences can happen. They can be targeted by a perpetrator without even knowing that they're doing it. And so Daniel Solórzano has a model of racial microaggressions in education. And he talks about how there are types of microaggressions, so how one is targeted by the microaggressions. There are contexts of where the microaggression occurs, how and where that microaggressions happens to students or people of color. There are effects of those microaggressions. There's physical, emotional, and psychological consequences of microaggressions. And that's what Queen Latifah is telling us in that clip, is that there are physical consequences of these everyday experiences she has in the workplace. And that there's responses to these experiences, how the individual responds to that racial microaggression. And so in this work, there were types and context. I focus on the type of racial microaggression, which is racist nativist microaggressions, I'll talk about in a moment. And the context I looked at was K-12 education. And so this is where we move from racial microaggressions to racist nativist microaggressions. And so racist nativist microaggressions are the systemic everyday forms of racist nativism that are subtle, layered, and cumulative verbal and nonverbal assaults directed toward people of color that are committed automatically and unconsciously. And so we're looking at racist nativist microaggressions as a type of racial microaggression. And so I look at English dominance as a type of racist nativist microaggressions that happens in K-12 classrooms. And so in order to understand the function of English dominance as racist nativist microaggressions, I look to the work of Macedo and Guarneri, who look at English as hegemony. What do these practices mean in a larger structural way, right? How can we understand English dominance as a structural practice? And so they say that subordination of the languages, knowledges, social practices, lived experiences, and cultures of linguistic minorities to achieve social, political, and economic domination. That this is a strategic process. And so English dominance then is an officially sanctioned form of English hegemony practiced in schools and classrooms emerging from racist nativism or racist nativist discourses. And so the practice of English dominance doesn't just stop there, right? This is part of a larger structural process of English as hegemony. And so the English dominance and notions of English-only policies and the English language being used in this way is not new. And there's been many scholars before me who have looked at this, right? Paulo Freire has looked at linguistic colonialism. Gloria Anzaldúa has talked about linguistic terrorism. Galanu and Virgil have talked about language restrictionism and restrictive language policies. And Shannon's talked about linguistic hegemony. And so I'm looking at English dominance as racist nativist microaggressions, which is how I'm kind of pushing this work. And so here, this is a story of Yarida. And Yarida came to the US when she was in 7th grade from Guerrero, Mexico. And she talks about her first day of 7th grade. And she remembers very vividly, again as a 23-year-old woman, as a 7th grader coming to the blacktop for her PE class. And she shared this experience. She said, my PE teacher, she was white, Miss Fox. The day we took pictures, ID pictures, she knew Spanish, but she didn't want to translate for me. She didn't want to tell me to go to the gym because we were taking pictures there. That was my second day, or her second day of school, when I first went. So she didn't want to tell me in Spanish, oh, go to the gym, we're taking the pictures over there. Instead, I just started walking and trying to ask people, but people didn't care, and they wouldn't help me. So I just started crying, like, oh my God, nobody likes me. Oh, I want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. And so here, Yarida talks about this experience of English dominance, but how she experienced in this very almost non-engaging way, right? Of her teacher silencing her teacher ignoring her teacher who knew that she could translate and tell Yarida what was going on and where to go. She simply did not, right? And so these feelings that Yarida had in response to this were just these feelings that she didn't belong in that space, that she didn't belong in that school. And so I'll share later on how these experiences and the cumulative effects of these experiences affected Yarida as a college student. So the second experience I'll share with you is Carolina. And Carolina was a US-born student. And she grew up in an area in the Inland Empire in Fontana, which is about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. It's a rural community, and she attended predominantly white elementary school. And she says when she came to that school, she didn't speak any English at all. And so when she's describing her first educational experience with me, she's talking about being in kindergarten. And so she says, I can't really pinpoint how I started speaking English. I do know when I went to kindergarten, I didn't know English, and in my first grade, they were trying to place me in bilingual classes. I guess because of stigma attached to it. My dad was a big proponent of getting me out of those classes. And so here she describes her transition from Spanish to English beginning in kindergarten, and that in the next quote, there's a stigma, right? Even after that, like second grade, I remember being targeted into remedial classes where you go do like speech therapy. They just make you repeat words properly. And by that time, I was already speaking English. But I knew that I had an accent because they were trying to kind of like, I wasn't saying words properly. Like one of my big problems was the ch and the sh sound. I couldn't say it all the time. And I remember sitting there and trying to pronounce chair versus share. And I still have problems. I always confuse them to this day, and I remember that. And so here, Carolina talks about this perceived deficiency of English learner students in her school, that she's taken out of classroom instruction time, right? She's taken out of that classroom into these one-on-one, what she perceives as speech therapy, that there's something wrong with her, that she needs to go to these therapy sessions with this person to try to understand how to pronounce English in the standard way, right? In the right way. And so here, Carolina is really, she's feeling the stigma of being an English learner student, but at the same time, she's learning that there's something wrong with her, that there's an academic deficiency in her not being able to communicate in the standard, normalized way that English should be spoken in schools. That her dad is also very cognizant of, right? And he knows that putting Carolina on that trajectory is, there's a potential that she may not have the educational opportunities that she would have if she was in mainstream English-only classes. And so I'll share another experience. And this is Lorena, who was a fifth-year Chicano Studies and Political Science major, and she's a U.S.-born student. And she talks about how she moved around a lot throughout her K-12. And so in middle school, she moved to South Central Los Angeles. She went from predominantly Latino elementary school to a Latino African-American school in middle school. And so she talks about her experience there. She said, by middle school, we moved again to South Central. So a lot of my classmates were Black now. And the environment changed a lot. And in that environment, I remember one teacher, she had a class where it was literally divided, that same class. This half in English, this half in Spanish. And we would do our reading quietly in the language she assigned to us. So I thought that was weird always. And so here, Lorena talks about how that classroom was physically divided between the Spanish dominant and the English dominant students. And how, because of the segregation of Los Angeles schools, that it was students of color sharing this classroom, but it was African American students who happened to be English dominant and the Latino students who happened to be Spanish dominant. And so she talks about the ways that she would be made fun of, that half of the class would be made fun of, that name calling, that they were dumb, that oh, you can't speak English, like oh, you don't know how to read, you don't know how to write, and that those tensions became racial tensions between students. That students in that classroom, all being students of color, began to internalize the English dominance practiced by that teacher, the way that the teacher physically divided this classroom. And that those tensions play out in very, very painful ways later on in high school when we have a lot of black-brown tensions between students in high schools. That it does start much earlier than high school. It starts in elementary school, it starts in middle school, and it is created by some of these teacher practices that the students experience. And so here we look at the types, again, racist, nativist, microaggressions, and the context was K-12 education. So now I'll talk about some of the effects, the physical, emotional, and psychological consequences of microaggressions, and some of the responses that the women had to them. And so I actually am going to revisit the story of Alicia, and Alicia was a student, the preschool student, who shared her experience of the teacher sending her to the doctor because they thought something was wrong with her ears. And so later on, throughout her interview, Alicia tells me numerous stories of things that happened to her, being a Spanish dominant student, her transition to English, and having to deal with a range of barriers with being an undocumented student. And she talks about being in her political science classes. She was a political science major, and what that was like for her. And she says poli-sci classes can be intimidating sometimes because I would say 90% are white students, like male white students. It's really intimidating when the professor asks you a question you're expected to know, and you're expected to be really articulate. For me, I was actually a little bit sad this week because I don't feel like I'm it's kind of sad to say, but I think I have problems with my speech. Sometimes a professor wants us to argue in class and make good points. And this girl was sitting in back of me, and she had some good arguments. I mean, words I had never even heard of, like from a poli-sci dictionary. And I was like, damn, why can't I do that? Why can't I be argumentative like that and articulate? And I got really sad, like, why can't I have good speech like that? And so here it was really powerful, and Alicia was so emotional when she was telling me this very painful experience of how she begins to internalize the English dominance that she had been targeted her entire life, the racist nativist practices that she has been experienced throughout her educational trajectory as an undocumented student within and outside of educational institutions, and how these experiences are cumulative, and it begins to affect the way she thinks about herself as a student, to where she thinks that there is something wrong with her. She talks about maybe visiting student psychological services on campus to see if she has a learning disability, to see if she has some type of speech impairment, because there must be something wrong with her. And it must not be, it doesn't become clear to her that it's the educational system that did not prepare her, that did not provide her with the opportunities to be one of those students who can talk like that in a college classroom. And so here's where I begin to theorize around internalized racist nativism and what that process looks like when a student internalizes the very racist nativism that they're targeted by. And so it's a conscious and unconscious, I think Alicia is doing it without being conscious of it, acceptance of racist nativism, which ascribes a perceived subordinate non-native status to Latinos in the US and happens regardless of immigration status. This internalization can potentially result in negative self, racial group, and/or immigrant group perceptions, and can cause psychological and physiological harm to those who suffer from it. And so I'm going to talk just very briefly in a couple more slides about the responses that these women have to these microaggressions, because they have very powerful responses to the ways that they're targeted in K-12, and it happens very early. And so I look at social counter spaces and academic counter spaces. And so this is also borrowing from the work of Daniel Solorzano and Tara Yoso, who do work on what these counter spaces look like in education. And counter spaces have been mostly looked at in higher education, how college students engage and form counter spaces. But in this work, I'm really finding that very young students are engaging in counter spaces. If they're not creating their own, they're engaging in their own spaces where they find a sense of community, where they can find a sense of healing from these everyday ways that they're subordinated, where they feel empowered, right? And where they can challenge those dominant narratives about them and about their communities. And so here, Yarida, again, we're revisiting. This is a student who was left on the playground and didn't know where to go to take her ID pictures. And she's talking about her, what she says is her ESL course, her ESL 1 course. And this is a picture of a bilingual ESL, well, it's a bilingual education program. And again, these pictures are not of the actual women. I can't technically do that. So I'm trying to engender a little bit of their lived experiences through these photos. But she describes her ESL class. And she says, what many students did was they already knew how to translate. So they would learn how to pronounce the words and then just give the information to the new students. Many students enrolled in the class after I got there. So when I learned how to say, can I go to the restroom? Or may I use the pencil? I'd share that information with other students that don't know, because I was in that situation too. It was a very emotional learning experience because it just wasn't Mexicans. It was a whole bunch of mostly girls from other Mexican states in Central America. That's when I first met students from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia. It was so cool because they spoke different, a different accent. So I learned so much. I learned how to dance punta, how to dance merengue, how to cook Salvadorian dishes. It was so emotional for me because I was so happy. It was one of those few times I felt that I really belonged. We would share our stories. There was a lot of experiences that we shared, and we felt like that we really belonged there. And so here, Yarida talks about how these experiences with racist nativist microaggressions always made her feel like she was different, always made her feel like she didn't belong. But in this ESL class, where these students came together and formed a community on their own, and engaged in that community to support each other. They engaged in that community to counter the dominant narratives of what people said about them that they were very aware of. And this was in middle school, right, in 7th grade when she came. And so I think it's really powerful how they turn this ESL classroom into a place where they feel supported and they feel a sense of community. And so this is a story, or this is a testimonial from Beatriz, and she's a 4th-year sociology major and undocumented student. And she also shared with me very painful experiences with racist Nativist microaggressions throughout her education. And she talks about how she joined a Valedictorico group at an after-school organization at her middle school. She came when she was 10 years old, and she went to a predominantly Latino school in Orange County, California. And so she shared what that experience was like for her. She said, I was in Valedictorico. I started when I was 13 years old, and it was just so great. The teacher, she's one woman I admire so much because not only did she want us to be good dancers, she wanted us to know and appreciate the culture of Mexico. The class was in Spanish. She told us, people are going to say a lot of things about you, but remember that wherever you go, you respect yourself. You represent you represent yourself. You represent your family, and you represent your culture, where you come from. I think that always stayed with me. She really wanted us to be great dancers, but also great students. It was just great to go after school every Thursday and have my dance classes. It gave me a sense of love for my culture. It really allowed me to escape for 1 hour. It was my hour to do something fun just for me. And so I really like that, to be in front of the whole school and just be very proud. People think that Mexico is just one little thing, but it's so complex and it's so many beautiful things. And so here she talks about how her teacher is this critical source of support for her. And that despite all of these experiences that she's having in middle school, that she should be proud of who she is, that she should be proud of where she comes from, that through her performance she needs to counter these dominant narratives and these dominant discourses of who she is and what Mexico is and what her peers are at the school. And so this is actually, when I talked to her, something that she's now an instructor at this program at her school, and so how she's kind of giving back to that community as well. And so here we talked about the types of racial microaggressions through racist Nativist microaggressions, the context, how it happens in K-12 education, the physical, emotional, and psychological consequences, the responses, how the individual responds to the microaggressions, and so the women talk about these experiences of depression, of sadness, internalizing them, blaming themselves of why they are not on par with their peers and they can't be good enough to be in some of these institutions, and the sense of academic self-doubt that creates. And also how the individual responds to microaggressions through social and academic counterspaces. And so in terms of future research, again, Macedo is who I borrow this concept of English as hegemony. And he talks about how progressive educators must acquire critical tools that would facilitate the development of a thorough understanding of the mechanisms employed by the dominant culture in the reproduction of those ideological elements that devalue, disconfirm, and subjugate cultural and linguistic minority students. And so I think that racist Nativist microaggressions, specifically, and racial microaggressions in general, can be one of those critical tools that we take with us into K-12 education classrooms to look at this process of subordination, how we're devalued, how we're disconfirmed, and how we're subjugated in the classrooms. And so in terms of future research, I think where my research is going now is, I think I want to look more closely at this cumulative process. The women definitely identified these cumulative ways that they experience racist Nativist microaggressions and how that affects them as college students in terms of their self-perceptions, in terms of the way that they internalize. And so I want to look more closely about how that process happens. And I think that there's also some very specific health implications. And so this is also borrowing from the work of Chester Pierce, who talks about racial microaggressions and those offensive mechanisms, but he says that there are serious physiological consequences of microaggressions, particularly in the African American community. So high blood pressure can be associated with that. Diabetes can be associated with those everyday stressors. There's a range of diseases and physical consequences of African Americans, for him in particular, but for students of color and people of color in general who experience these everyday cumulative assaults on their well-being and how that affects one's health and public and mental health in general. And finally, I think it's important to look at some of the most extreme, I think, cases of internalizing, and the most extreme cases of the physical and the physiological consequences were of the undocumented women in this study, where there was clear ways that racist Nativist microaggressions affected all women, that the undocumented women in particular really suffered. Some of them ended up in hospitals, some of them ended up having to take medication, which is a combination of the racist Nativist microaggressions that they experience, but also a combination of how they're affected by racist Nativism and social policies that subordinate them, their families, and their communities, and having to live with those daily stressors every day of seeing a neighbor's house raided by ICE, right? What happened to one woman the night before she came to an interview, and that process of having that stress on you is a constant thing that students have to deal with as only one part of their educational experience. It's only one part of their lives, aside from all of the many things that they have to deal with to get through the university. And so that's something else that I want to look at in terms of future research. And so that's my presentation, and I just want to thank you for sitting through a very long one, but I hope that I'm happy to take questions, and I'm happy to engage in a conversation about this work, because I think that it's in spaces like these with other students and with other scholars, supportive scholars and critical scholars, where I get the best feedback, so it's a little selfish for me, but I just want to thank all of you for also coming out and listening to my presentation today. So, I went to so based on my theory, like I mentioned earlier, is critical, right? The frames that I'm using, those tenets of CRT and LatCrit, Chicana feminist epistemology, right? And testimonio, right? Are all very conscious and what's the word I'm looking for? Strategic moves to unveil these systems of oppression, right? And so all of these things are at play in the analysis process using critical race grounded theory. And so I had to go back, I had to go revise my codes, I had to trash some codes, I had to make new codes. And so I came up kind of with a final code list, and I used Atlas TI, which is a qualitative software to do that final coding process. And then, you know, when you can get overwhelmed with your data, so you have to have some kind of organizational tool for that. So that's what I did in that process. But, it's a little plug, I did write an article on the methodological process that I did, because when I was a student, I was telling some of the women earlier that you feel that you want to do justice to the stories that people are telling you, that you don't want to misconstrue them, that you want them to be true to how they see it. And so I think keeping in contact constantly with them throughout the process, to check in with them about your analysis, and to think in critical ways about how I can create, you know, if the methodological processes that I'm learning in my graduate program and that I'm reading about in books don't fit exactly what I want to do, let's borrow from everything and let's take what's useful for me. And yes, we can create our own methodological processes, and I've been challenged on that too, but yes, we can. And so I wrote about that in a piece, and I can share that with you if you'd like to see that too, of exactly what that looks like.
Just out of curiosity, though, you're talking to college students, right? So how do you think that process would work if you were to deal with high school students, for example? Like how would it look, or younger? Well, let's start with high school.
Yeah.
Let's not go to fifth graders. But you know, I mean, how do you think? Like, is this applicable to any age group, or do you think this was specific to your?
Well, I think in the exact way that I used it, because we can't come into a high school focus group and talk about codes and talk about, you know, emerging themes. But I am actually talking about this very issue with a colleague in my department who wants to look at racial microaggressions, but with third and fourth graders in a classroom she's in. So we've been talking about, okay, how do we translate this process into something that works for, you know, 8 and 9-year-olds? And so I think it's possible, and we've been talking about it, but I think it's the way that we frame it and the language that we use. Because as we saw earlier, the little girl with the sign and Daisy, the 9-year-old, can tell us, right? They can identify race and racism for us. And they can tell us about their experiences, and they're just as powerful as the college students. They tell it in a very different way, but we have to learn relearn that language, right? So that we can frame it in a way that works for them too. And so we're kind of working through that, as what that would look like for students who are much younger and don't really know about, you know, the research process.
Well, and especially they're trained to listen to authority, right?
Yeah.
They're not trained to push back at adults.
Exactly.
And so I think that would be another process. And so my final question is just, did you share the final with your folks?
Yeah. And so after the focus groups, I'm really close to a couple of the women now, and it's funny how relationships kind of have developed over the course of this work, but that's, I think, part of the process. But I have checked in with them at every stage. I do send them, when I publish something, hey, look what we did. And I do ask that we try to keep in touch also, I think, throughout this work, because that's important too, as the theory develops and as the methodological process develops and the work moves forward, is how we stay in touch and stay within kind of a community, because these are still their experiences. And I'm, moving on and making these publications and getting this work out, but it's important also to stay connected to them too, and to have them put me in check when they need to. Yes.
Can you say some more about how you saw like these stigmatized categories of Latin culture, like speaking Spanish, interact with other categories like gender and race and class?
Uh-huh. So I think that there were environments. Are you talking about like in like white and Latino students, or
whatever you like being a woman versus being a man, being upper versus lower class?
Oh, I see. Okay, so like where class and gender kind of emerged in the intersections?
Did they make these microaggressions worse, for example? Like did people just have more conversation to throw at a person if they saw them like having, not just like a middle class like Spanish speaker, but like a lower class woman with very dark skin, for example?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that phenotype also plays a role in this, and the fact that and this is also, I think, my future work is looking at men and experiences of men, because there are gendered microaggressions, and the experiences of the women are not just racialized, and it's not just based on status, but it also has to do with the fact that they're women, and the fact that they're low-income women, and that they're from low-income immigrant communities, right, in these experiences. So I think untangling that is something that is also important to look at, and then being able to incorporate kind of comparative groups, right? So I can say, okay, now I've done interviews with Chicano males. What are their gendered experiences, and how do those compare with the women, and do they experience microaggressions in the same ways, and racist names microaggressions in the same ways?
No questions? We have time for one more.
So I'm interested in bilingual education and how people experience bilingual education in general, and we know that it has a lot of potential to be really great, but it doesn't come to fruition that way, or it can be very, your example that you had there, it's very stigmatized. Mm-hmm. So do you have any examples of positive experiences going through bilingual education?
Yeah.
Is that a common experience?
So in the women's experiences, we're talking about students who went through public education, who live in who are going through restricted language policies, right? There's this kind of limit to them, and so and to what they've been able to experience in their K-12 educations. So in terms of the positive experience, like there's those counter spaces, right, that students create on their own despite these experiences and coming together as communities. But I think unfortunately, bilingual education in California is something that we need to build on the strengths of students, right, and to learn from those counter spaces that they're developing. My daughter goes to one of these schools, and it's not an LAUSD, it's actually a lab school that works with the university that is essentially a dual immersion program, right, that builds on the strengths of students. And I think it's the research is our first step, right, is to look at what are these practices that teachers engage in the classroom that really draws on the strengths, that doesn't stigmatize, that doesn't essentialize, that doesn't divide students, and how do we build on that, and how do we develop practices that will be sustainable, right, and be possible within the public school system that's kind of mandated by NCD and by 227. So I think that that's also important to look at. But there's some important spaces that aren't necessarily public schools, and maybe there are, that I'm sure there's some.
So that was
schools.
not a common experience within the group of people participating in your research?
The microaggressions?
In your study?
I think the ESL classroom, the shelter.
Oh, the counter space. No. That was one student who shared the way that the students formed this counter space in her ESL class, but that was something a lot of students didn't have the opportunity to have, I think.
Any final? One more final?
Yeah,
Yep.
one more. I'm wondering if you found like context effects, like were some schools worse than others? Were some people, like, because they had school popularity or something, was it less bad for them, like more positive relationships, or were they consistently like excluded? And
I think there was a consistency among their experiences in terms of how they experienced racist nativism and exclusion and alienation, and those were actually my predominant findings, and English dominance. It was English dominance, negative perceptions, and alienation and exclusion, and so those were the kind of predominant consistent themes in the study. But again, how students respond to that, I think we see the more hopeful, the more powerful ways of how students navigate and learn critical navigational tools to get around those experiences to still succeed. So it didn't come from the institution, it came from the students.
So that's kind of the empowering message here. It's like, let's help people deal better with this crap because it's there.
And how do we draw from those strengths and those strategies that they use? Because they work.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all my wonderful staff, Chinua, Alejandro, Christina, Rosa, for helping us put this on today, and thank Lindsay for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, and I have my email address.